You can have the best computers in the world, Derek Cole muttered, slamming the side panel of the silent helicopter with the flat of his hand. But that bird still won't fly. The words hung in the hot Texas air as the massive AH-64 Apache sat motionless on the concrete apron of Fort Redstone's flight line, its long rotor blades drooping slightly in the afternoon heat like tired wings. Around it, a dozen technicians in crisp maintenance uniforms stood surrounded by tool carts, rugged laptops, diagnostic cables, and open maintenance manuals glowing on tablet screens. Everything about the scene looked modern, precise, and professional. Everything except the helicopter itself, which refused to cooperate. The diagnostic software insisted every subsystem was green. Fuel pressure was normal. Electrical continuity was perfect. Sensors were reporting exactly what they were supposed to report. According to the computers, the Apache should have been ready to lift off hours ago. Yet the engine refused to start. Derek wiped a streak of grease from his hands and glanced toward the shaded viewing stand about 200 yards away where a group of visiting officers and civilian contractors were waiting for a demonstration flight that was now running more than an hour behind schedule. Lieutenant Mason Reed stood beside him, arms folded tight across his chest, the tension obvious even beneath the clean lines of his pressed uniform. "Command's not going to like this," Reed said quietly. Derek let out a dry laugh. "Command already doesn't like it." He looked back at the helicopter as if daring it to prove him wrong. The Apache was a masterpiece of American engineering, 48 feet of armored precision designed to dominate the battlefield. Right now it looked like an expensive statue baking under the sun. A gust of warm wind rolled across the tarmac, rattling a loose tag on one of the open maintenance panels. Derek kicked the tire of the landing gear lightly, frustration creeping into his voice. 6 hours, he said. 6 hours and 3 full system checks. If the computer says there's no problem, there shouldn't be a problem. That was when Mason noticed the old man standing near the edge of the flight line. He had arrived so quietly no one had seen him walk up. He wasn't wearing a uniform, just a faded olive jacket and worn jeans that looked decades older than the polished machines. Around him, in one hand, he carried a small leather tool pouch darkened by years of oil and sun. The man didn't say anything. He simply stood there watching the helicopter with calm pale eyes, as if the Apache were speaking a language only he could hear. Derek followed Mason's gaze and frowned. "Who's that?" he asked. Mason shook his head. "No idea." The old man stepped a little closer to the aircraft, slow and unhurried, his boots making a soft crunch against the gravel at the edge of the concrete pad. Derek walked toward him immediately, irritation sharpening his tone. "Sir, this is a restricted maintenance zone," he said. "Visitors need to stay behind the barrier." The old man stopped, looking past Derek rather than at him, studying the Apache's engine, housing with quiet focus. His voice when he spoke was low, roughened by time, but steady. "That engine isn't dead," he said calmly. Derek blinked. "Excuse me." The man shifted his gaze to the helicopter again, listening to the faint ticking sound of metal cooling under the sun. "She's trying to tell you what's wrong," he added softly. Derek stared at him for a moment, then laughed under his breath. "Yeah," he said, "and I suppose you can hear it." The old man gave the smallest nod. "Sometimes," he said, "machines talk if you've spent enough years listening." Mason glanced between them, uncertain whether to step in or stay quiet. Derek crossed his arms and looked the man up and down, from the worn boots to the old leather pouch. "Let me guess," Derek said dryly. "You used to work on helicopters back in the day." The man's expression didn't change. "Something like that." Derek shook his head and gestured toward the rows of diagnostic screens glowing beside the aircraft. "Well, today we use computers." The old man studied the Apache for another long second before replying. "That's the problem," he said quietly. The remark lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Derek Cole stared at the old man for a moment as the heat shimmered above the concrete, and the ticking of the Apache's cooling metal echoed faintly from inside the engine housing. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Derek let out a short breath and shook his head as if brushing away an annoyance. "Machines talk," he repeated, the words heavy with disbelief. "Right." He turned away and walked back toward the open maintenance cart, where 2 rugged laptops were running another system scan. Lieutenant Mason Reed followed, casting one last uncertain glance toward the stranger before lowering his voice. "You want me to call security?" Derek shook his head. "No, he is harmless." He leaned over the laptop screen, scrolling through lines of diagnostic data that glowed bright green against the shaded display. Every column still read the same thing. All systems operational. No detected faults. Derek pointed at the screen as if presenting evidence to a courtroom. "See that?" he said quietly. "Fuel pressure stable. Ignition circuits good. Turbine rotation clear. The computer says this engine should be running." Mason exhaled slowly. "But it is not." Derek closed the laptop halfway with a frustrated snap. Exactly. Behind them, the old man had taken a slow step closer to the helicopter. He did not touch it. He simply stood near the engine cowling, head slightly tilted, eyes following the shape of the aircraft the way a musician might study a familiar instrument. The long shadow of the Apache stretched across the tarmac, the afternoon sun reflecting off the matte gray fuselage. Around the aircraft, the technicians resumed their work, cables shifting, tool drawers sliding open and shut, the quiet hum of electronics filling the air. Yet despite all the activity, the machine itself remained stubbornly silent. Derek walked back toward the helicopter with Mason at his side, irritation returning to his voice. "Look, sir," he said, stopping a few feet from the old man. "I appreciate the curiosity, but this is a maintenance operation run by certified aviation technicians. We have procedures." The man nodded once, calm and unbothered. "I can see that." Derek gestured toward the helicopter. "We have already run 3 complete system diagnostics. The aircraft passed every one of them." The old man studied the engine housing again before replying. "Then you have proven the computer works." Derek folded his arms. "Yes." The old man lifted his gaze slightly, meeting Derek's eyes for the first time. "But the helicopter does not." Mason shifted his weight, the quiet confidence in the stranger's voice creating a strange tension none of the technicians could quite explain. Derek gave a small sarcastic smile. "Let me guess. You think you know something the diagnostics missed?" The man did not answer immediately. A faint breeze moved across the tarmac, carrying the smell of warm metal and jet fuel. Finally he spoke, his voice almost reflective. "Computers read numbers," he said. "Pilots read instruments. Mechanics read machines." Derek glanced at Mason as if sharing a private joke. "And which one are you?" he asked. The man rested a hand lightly on the old leather pouch at his side. "Someone who has been listening to helicopters for a very long time." Derek looked him over again, the worn jacket, the weathered face, the quiet certainty that did not seem to belong in a place ruled by software and procedure. He let out another breath and turned back toward the Apache. "Well," he said dryly, "unless you plan to whisper to it, we are still waiting for that engine to start." The old man looked back at the aircraft, eyes calm, voice steady. "It will," he said softly, "once you stop asking the wrong questions." For a moment Derek Cole said nothing. The old man's words hung in the air like a quiet challenge, and that alone irritated him more than an argument would have. Around them the technicians continued moving cables and checking connectors, the small sounds of tools tapping metal echoing under the wide Texas sky. Derek finally let out a slow breath and rubbed his hands on a shop rag. "All right," he said with a thin smile that carried more impatience than humor. "You keep talking like you belong here." He gestured toward the helicopter. "So tell me something useful. What exactly do you think we are missing?" The old man did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the Apache as if the question had been directed toward the aircraft instead of him. The sunlight reflected softly along the curved housing of the engine cowling, and somewhere inside the machine a faint metallic tick echoed as heated parts cooled at slightly different speeds. The man stepped closer, slow and deliberate, until he stood beside the open panel Derek had examined earlier. Mason Reed watched him carefully, unsure whether to stop him or let the moment play out. The stranger did not touch anything yet. He simply studied the lines of the machine, head tilted slightly. "How many hours since the last turbine assembly replacement?" the old man asked calmly. Derek frowned. "That has nothing to do with this." "How many hours?" the man repeated. Derek glanced at Mason, then back at the helicopter. 836, he said after a moment. "Why?" The old man nodded slowly as if that answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "And the last vibration calibration?" Derek's patience began to thin. 2 weeks ago. Look, sir, the system diagnostics already account for all of that. The man finally rested one hand gently against the edge of the panel. His fingers did not probe or twist anything. They simply rested there, feeling the surface of the metal like someone testing the temperature of water before stepping into it. Diagnostics measure what the system knows how to measure, he said quietly. Derek crossed his arms. Yes, that is how engineering works. The man gave a small nod. And helicopters do not always follow engineering. Mason shifted slightly, glancing at the Apache again as if expecting it to suddenly react to the conversation. Derek exhaled sharply through his nose. All right, he said. Let me make this simple. That engine has passed every electronic check we can run. The ignition circuit is clean. The fuel system is clear. The turbine spins freely. If there were a mechanical fault, the computer would flag it. The old man slowly removed his hand from the metal panel. His gaze remained thoughtful, almost distant. Not if the fault is too small to be recognized as a fault, he replied. Derek stared at him, clearly unconvinced. Too small, he repeated. The man looked toward the long rotor blades stretching above them, then back to the engine housing. Machines that fly spend years under pressure, he said. Heat, vibration, thousands of rotations every minute. Eventually something changes that the original design never expected. Derek shook his head. You are guessing. The man finally turned to face him fully. His expression was calm, almost patient. No, he said. I am listening. Derek was about to respond when a young specialist standing near the tool cart quietly paused his work and looked up. Owen Hart had been tightening a cable connector while half listening to the exchange, but something about the old man's voice had caught his attention. There was no arrogance in it, no attempt to impress anyone, just certainty. Owen studied the man's weathered face for a moment, then glanced at the worn leather pouch hanging at his side. A faint memory stirred somewhere in the back of his mind, something he had once heard in the hangar break room from an older crew chief who liked telling stories about the early days of the base. Owen did not speak yet. He simply kept watching as the stranger turned back toward the Apache and said quietly, almost to the aircraft itself, You have been trying to tell them for hours. The quiet confidence in the old man's voice only deepened Derek Cole's irritation. He stared at the Apache for a moment, then turned back toward the stranger with a tight expression that barely concealed his frustration. Around them the afternoon heat pressed down on the flight line, and the metallic scent of warm machinery drifted through the air. Technicians moved between tool carts and open panels, their conversations low and tense as the stalled helicopter continued to refuse every attempt to bring it to life. Derek folded his arms and let out a short breath. All right, he said. You keep saying the machine is trying to tell us something. So what exactly is it saying? The old man did not look at him. His attention remained on the engine housing as he slowly stepped closer, studying the alignment of the outer panel seams. It is saying that someone fixed the wrong problem, he replied calmly. Derek gave a small laugh. That would be impressive considering nothing is broken. The man's eyes traced the curve of the intake housing before he answered. Something changed, he said quietly. Something small enough that the system still believes everything is normal. Mason Reed glanced between them, sensing the tension building again. Derek gestured toward the laptop sitting open on the tool cart nearby. Every component has been scanned, he said. Fuel regulators, turbine sensors, ignition modules, control relays. If a part failed, the system would flag it immediately. The old man nodded slightly. Yes, he said. If a part failed. Derek frowned. What does that mean? The man finally crouched slightly beside the engine cowling, his weathered eyes studying the bolts that secured the panel in place. His fingers hovered near the metal, but still did not touch it. Sometimes nothing fails, he said. Sometimes parts simply stop agreeing with each other. Derek shook his head, already dismissing the explanation. That is not how aircraft systems work. The man looked up at him with the faintest trace of a patient smile. That is exactly how aircraft systems work after enough hours in the air. A technician pushing a rolling cart paused nearby, listening quietly before continuing on. The sound of a distant transport plane passing overhead drifted faintly across the sky. Derek rubbed the back of his neck and glanced again at the silent Apache, clearly unwilling to entertain the idea, but unable to completely dismiss it either. Look, he said finally, we have been running modern maintenance systems here for years. Those systems are designed by the same engineers who built this helicopter. The old man slowly stood again, brushing dust from his hands. Engineers design machines for the day they are built, he said. Experience understands what happens 10 years later. Derek opened his mouth to reply, but hesitated when the stranger reached down and gently rested his palm against a narrow seam along the lower edge of the engine housing. He held it there for a few seconds, eyes closed slightly, as if concentrating on something subtle within the metal frame. The gesture looked strange against the backdrop of laptops and digital readouts, almost old-fashioned. Mason watched carefully, curiosity beginning to replace his earlier skepticism. The old man eventually removed his hand and glanced toward the long rotor mast above them. There is a vibration imbalance somewhere in the startup cycle, he said softly. Not large enough for the system to classify as a fault, but large enough that the engine refuses to complete ignition. Derek blinked. You are diagnosing that by touching the panel? The man looked at him calmly. By listening. Derek exhaled through his nose and turned away, clearly unimpressed. Right, he muttered. But a few feet away, Owen Hart had stopped working completely now, staring at the old leather pouch hanging from the stranger's shoulder. The memory that had stirred earlier was growing stronger. Somewhere in the back of Owen's mind, he remembered an old maintenance story told during a night shift months ago, a story about a crew chief who could identify engine problems before instruments detected them. Owen looked again at the man standing beside the Apache and felt a quiet realization begin to form. Derek Cole thought he was arguing with a curious visitor. Owen was beginning to suspect they might be talking to someone the base should have recognized the moment he walked onto the flight line. Owen Hart could no longer focus on the connector in his hands. The wrench rested motionless against the bolt, while his attention remained fixed on the quiet old man beside the helicopter. Around the flight line, the work continued as it had for hours, tools moving, screens glowing, technicians speaking in short, frustrated sentences, yet the stranger stood completely still beside the Apache, as if the noise around him belonged to another world. Owen studied the man carefully now. The faded olive jacket, the slow, deliberate movements, the leather pouch hanging from his shoulder that looked older than some of the aircraft on base. Something about it felt familiar in a way that made the back of Owen's mind itch. Derek Cole, meanwhile, had already turned away again, his patience for the conversation clearly gone. He walked back toward the laptop cart and began scrolling through another set of diagnostics, his voice edged with irritation. Run the ignition cycle again, he told Mason Reed. If there is even a minor fluctuation, I want to see it. Mason nodded and moved toward the control panel connected to the helicopter's monitoring system. The Apache remained silent. The sunlight reflected across the canopy glass, and the long rotor blades cast sharp shadows across the concrete. The aircraft looked powerful even while it refused to move. Behind them, the old man slowly reached down and unclipped the small leather pouch from his belt. The motion caught Owen's attention immediately. The pouch was worn smooth from years of handling, its dark brown leather creased with age and stained by oil that had soaked into it long ago. The snap button opened with a soft metallic click. Inside were tools that looked nothing like the polished modern equipment on the maintenance carts. A narrow wrench with the edges rounded from decades of use. A flathead screwdriver with a wooden handle worn pale from thousands of turns. A thin metal gauge that had clearly been shaped by hand. Derek noticed the movement and turned back, one eyebrow raised in disbelief. You brought antiques, he said dryly. The old man glanced at the tools as if they were old friends. They still work, he replied calmly. Derek laughed once, shaking his head. That helicopter cost nearly $35 million, and you think those museum pieces are going to fix it? The old man did not argue. Instead, he held the small wrench in his hand for a moment, his fingers resting along the worn steel. For the briefest second, his expression shifted, not with pride or anger, but with memory. The sounds of the modern flight line faded somewhere behind his thoughts. In his mind, there was the deep, steady thump of rotor blades turning through humid air, the smell of warm fuel and oil drifting through a jungle clearing. A younger version of the same helicopter sitting on uneven ground while a crew waited inside, engine struggling, time slipping away 1 second at a time. The same worn wrench turning a bolt under impossible pressure while the entire aircraft vibrated around him. The memory passed quickly, leaving only the quiet certainty in his eyes. He slipped the tool back into the pouch and closed the snap again. Derek watched the gesture with open skepticism. "Look," he said, "we appreciate the enthusiasm, but we already have the best maintenance systems the Army has ever built. Computers, sensors, predictive diagnostics. That is how modern aviation works." The old man lifted his gaze toward the Apache once more. The calm in his voice never changed. "Machines change," he said softly, "but the way they fail does not." A few feet away, Owen felt the memory in his mind finally fall into place. Months earlier, an old chief mechanic had told a story during a late-night shift, a story about a crew chief who could diagnose engine trouble just by listening to the rotor spin. The name had stuck in Owen's head because the older mechanics had spoken it with quiet respect. Owen looked again at the man standing beside the silent helicopter and felt his stomach tighten slightly. He slowly stepped away from the tool cart and pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering above the screen as he glanced once more toward the stranger and the old leather pouch that had just opened. Derek Cole still believed they were dealing with a stubborn visitor. Owen was beginning to realize they might be standing beside someone the base had not seen in a very long time. Owen Hart stepped a few yards away from the maintenance carts, his phone held low in his hand so no one would notice what he was doing. The heat rolling off the tarmac shimmered around the aircraft, and the distant hum of activity from other hangars drifted across the base, but Owen's attention stayed locked on the quiet figure standing beside the Apache. The name was there now in the back of his mind, faint but unmistakable, like a call sign heard over an old radio. He opened the base maintenance directory and typed it slowly with his thumb. Samuel Vance. The screen hesitated for a moment before the archive record appeared. Owen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Texas heat. The entry was not recent. It was older than half the technicians on the flight line. Former senior crew chief. Rotary wing specialist. Vietnam-era maintenance unit. Several commendations attached to the record, along with a short note marked legacy technical consultant. Owen lowered the phone slightly and looked back toward the helicopter. The quiet old man standing beside the engine housing was not a curious visitor. He was someone who had once kept aircraft flying when the only tools available were instinct, experience, and a handful of steel wrenches. Meanwhile, Derek Cole remained focused on the diagnostic laptop, determined to prove that the machine would eventually reveal its fault through the proper system checks. "Cycle the ignition monitor again," Derek said to Mason Reed without looking up. Mason pressed a sequence on the tablet connected to the Apache's monitoring port. The engine responded with the same reluctant whine as before, the startup sequence beginning for a few seconds before stopping abruptly as the control system detected instability. The helicopter fell silent again. Derek leaned closer to the screen. "There," he said. "You see that fluctuation in the turbine startup speed?" Mason squinted at the graph. "It drops just before ignition lock." Derek nodded sharply. "Exactly. Something in the startup cycle is rejecting the rotation balance." Behind them, Samuel Vance had stepped slowly around to the other side of the engine cowling. His movements were unhurried, almost thoughtful, like someone walking through a room he had known for years. He crouched slightly and studied the lower access panel near the turbine intake. His hand rested lightly against the metal surface again, fingers spread gently across the warm alloy skin. He closed his eyes for a moment as the faint vibration of the aborted startup still lingered in the frame of the aircraft. When he spoke, his voice was calm and certain. "It is not the turbine." Derek did not even turn around. "We already know that." Samuel opened his eyes and looked at the seam of the panel just below the intake duct. "The turbine is compensating for something upstream." Derek sighed loudly and finally turned back toward him. "You keep saying things like that, but you are not actually explaining anything." Samuel stood again and gestured toward the panel bolts. The alignment inside that intake housing changed after the last calibration. Derek frowned. "Impossible. The system would detect misalignment." Samuel shook his head gently. "Not this kind." Derek crossed his arms again, clearly unimpressed. "And what kind is that?" Samuel's gaze moved from the panel to the rotor mass towering above them. "A vibration imbalance caused by pressure drift between the intake coupling and the startup regulator. Small enough that the sensors believe it is normal. Large enough that the engine refuses to complete ignition." Derek stared at him for a second before letting out a dry laugh. "You just diagnosed a $35 million helicopter by touching the outside panel." Samuel did not respond to the sarcasm. He simply looked back at the Apache with the quiet patience of someone who had spent decades understanding machines that did not care about pride or rank. A few yards away, Owen Hart closed the archive file on his phone and looked toward the command building at the far end of the flight line. If the name he had just read was correct, someone higher in the chain of command needed to know who was standing beside that aircraft. And the longer the technicians argued with him, the more certain Owen became that they were ignoring the one person on the base who already understood exactly why the Apache would not start. Owen Hart stood still for several seconds, the phone still in his hand, the maintenance archive closed, but the name still echoing in his mind. Samuel Vance. The old chief who could hear problems before instruments could measure them. The stories he had heard months ago suddenly felt less like exaggerated hangar talk and more like a warning that the younger technicians had missed. Owen looked back toward the helicopter. Derek Cole was still standing near the diagnostic laptop with Mason Reed beside him, both focused on the glowing screen as another system check rolled through its cycle. Numbers updated. Status indicators flashed green, and yet the aircraft remained stubbornly silent. The old man stood beside the engine housing exactly where Owen had last seen him, patient, unmoving, watching the machine with the same quiet attention he had shown since the moment he arrived. Owen slipped the phone back into his pocket and walked a few steps farther away from the group, positioning himself near the edge of the flight line where the noise of the maintenance work would cover the sound of his voice. He pulled the phone out again and scrolled through the command contact directory. The name he was looking for appeared halfway down the list. Command Operations Office. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing the call button. The line rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. Command Operations. Owen lowered his voice. This is Specialist Owen Hart on the Redstone flight line. I need to pass along something that might require command attention. There was a short pause on the other end. Go ahead. Owen glanced back toward the helicopter before continuing. There is an individual on the flight line assisting with the Apache startup issue. His name is Samuel Vance. The silence that followed lasted several seconds longer than Owen expected. Repeat the name, the voice said. Samuel Vance. Owen replied clearly. The pause grew heavier this time. Owen could almost hear someone shifting in their chair on the other end of the line. Is he physically present with the aircraft? The voice asked carefully. Yes, sir, Owen said. He is standing beside the engine housing right now. Another pause. Then the voice changed slightly, losing some of its casual tone. Do not interfere with him, the operator said quietly. Remain where you are. The line clicked off before Owen could respond. Owen lowered the phone slowly and looked back toward the maintenance team. Nothing had changed yet. Derek was still reviewing system logs while Mason leaned over the tablet studying ignition timing graphs. Neither of them had any idea that the name Owen had just spoken carried weight far beyond the flight line. Samuel Vance, meanwhile, had moved a few inches closer to the intake housing, examining the bolts along the lower seam with careful attention. He did not rush. He did not argue. He simply studied the aircraft like someone reading a familiar page in a book that everyone else had forgotten. How to open. A warm gust of wind swept across the tarmac, fluttering the maintenance checklist clipped to Derek's workstation. The Apache sat silent under the sun, its long rotor blades casting narrow shadows across the concrete. Owen folded his arms and waited. Something in the tone of the voice on the phone had made one thing clear. The chain of command had recognized the name immediately, and somewhere inside the command building at the far end of the base, people who understood exactly who Samuel Vance was had just started moving. The change began subtly, almost too quietly for anyone on the flight line to notice at first. A black command vehicle rolled onto the concrete from the far end of the base road, moving faster than vehicles usually traveled near active aircraft. Owen Hart noticed it immediately. The vehicle's dark windows reflected the bright afternoon sun as it approached the maintenance area, slowing only when it reached the edge of the flight line. Derek Cole did not notice it yet. He was still leaning over the diagnostic laptop, studying a graph of turbine rotation that refused to stabilize long enough for the ignition sequence to complete. Run the startup again, Derek said to Mason Reed. Mason nodded and tapped the control tablet. The Apache responded with the same hesitant whine, the turbine attempting to spin up before cutting itself off again. The sound faded into silence, leaving only the faint metallic ticking of hot components cooling under the sun. Derek exhaled sharply. There is nothing mechanically wrong, he insisted. The system just cannot settle the startup balance. A car door closed somewhere behind them with a heavy sound that carried across the tarmac. Owen looked up. 3 uniformed personnel had stepped out of the vehicle, their posture straight and purposeful as they began walking toward the helicopter. The man in front wore the rank of lieutenant general on his shoulders. His stride was calm but direct, the kind of walk that carried authority even before a single word was spoken. Owen felt a quiet sense of relief settle in his chest. The call had worked. The chain of command had responded faster than he expected. Derek finally glanced over his shoulder when he noticed the technicians nearby growing unusually quiet. His eyes followed their gaze across the concrete. When he saw the approaching officer, his posture straightened immediately. Mason noticed as well and stepped back from the control tablet. "General on the line," Mason said quietly. Derek closed the laptop halfway and wiped his hands on the shop rag again before turning to face the approaching group. Meanwhile, Samuel Vance remained exactly where he had been standing beside the Apache's intake housing. He did not react to the arriving vehicle or the sudden shift in attention around him. His gaze remained fixed on the panel seam he had been studying earlier, as if the helicopter still held the only conversation that mattered. The lieutenant general stopped about 10 feet from the aircraft. His eyes moved quickly across the maintenance team, then settled on the old man beside the engine housing. The change in the officer's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Recognition came first, then something deeper. Respect. He stepped forward another few feet, ignoring the technicians who had instinctively straightened to attention. "Mr. Vance," the general said calmly. The name carried across the quiet flight line. Derek blinked in confusion. Mason glanced toward Owen, who simply watched in silence. Samuel Vance finally turned his head. The moment he saw the officer, his expression softened slightly, the faintest hint of familiarity crossing his weathered face. "General Whitaker," he replied in the same calm voice he had used all afternoon. The technicians exchanged quick glances. Derek's confusion deepened. He had expected a brief inspection, perhaps a reprimand for the delay. Instead, the commanding officer of the base had addressed the old man beside the helicopter as if greeting someone he had known for years. The general stepped closer to the aircraft and looked briefly at the silent Apache before turning back to Samuel. "I heard there was a startup problem," Whitaker said. Samuel nodded once. "Small imbalance in the intake regulator coupling," he replied. "It is confusing the ignition cycle." The general gave a slight smile that carried quiet understanding. "I had a feeling." Derek stared between them, the realization slowly forming that the man he had been dismissing all afternoon was not a curious visitor at all. Samuel Vance reached down and picked up the worn leather pouch again, opening the snap with the same soft click as before. "If no one objects," he said gently, "I believe the helicopter is ready to start listening again." No one spoke for several seconds after Samuel Vance opened the leather pouch. The quiet on the flight line felt different now, heavier, as if the weight of the moment had finally settled across the concrete. Derek Cole stood frozen beside the laptop card, the confidence that had filled his voice all afternoon slowly draining away. Lieutenant General Whitaker stepped slightly to the side of the helicopter, giving Samuel a clear space near the intake housing. "You have the floor," the general said calmly. Samuel nodded once in appreciation, but said nothing else. He reached into the pouch and removed the narrow steel wrench whose edges had been worn smooth by decades of use. In the bright sunlight, the tool looked simple, almost unimpressive compared to the rows of advanced equipment surrounding the aircraft. Yet Samuel handled it with the quiet familiarity of someone who had trusted that tool through countless long nights beside machines that refused to cooperate. He crouched beside the lower intake panel and examined the row of bolts one more time. His fingers moved slowly along the seam, pausing at a single bolt near the regulator coupling housing. "This one," he said softly. Derek leaned forward without realizing it. Samuel slid the wrench into place and gave the bolt the smallest adjustment, no more than a subtle fraction of a turn. The movement was so small that anyone unfamiliar with aircraft maintenance might have thought it meaningless. But Samuel did not rush. He waited, resting his palm lightly against the metal frame of the intake housing again, as if feeling the structure respond. Then he stood and stepped back from the helicopter. "Try the startup now," he said. Mason Reed glanced toward Derek for confirmation. Derek hesitated only a second before nodding slowly. Mason tapped the control tablet and initiated the ignition sequence once again. The Apache responded with the familiar rising whine of the turbine beginning its rotation. For the first few seconds, the sound was identical to the previous attempts. The rotor assembly above them shifted slightly as the system entered the early stage of the startup cycle. Derek's eyes remained locked on the diagnostic screen, waiting for the same drop in rotation speed that had stopped the engine every other time. But the drop never came. The turbine continued accelerating smoothly through the ignition threshold. A deep, steady rumble followed as the engine finally settled into full startup rotation. The long rotor blades above them began to move, slowly at first, then with gathering rhythm as the aircraft came alive. The sound rolled across the flight line like distant thunder. Several technicians stepped back instinctively as the familiar pulse of the helicopter returned. Derek stared at the screen in disbelief. The graph lines that had refused to stabilize all afternoon now climbed smoothly across the display. Mason lowered the tablet slowly, a stunned expression crossing his face. Samuel Vance simply closed the leather pouch and clipped it back onto his belt. Lieutenant General Whitaker watched the helicopter spin up for another few seconds before turning toward the maintenance crew. Sometimes, the general said quietly, experience is the best diagnostic system we have. Derek looked toward Samuel, the realization finally settling in fully. The man he had dismissed as an outdated mechanic had solved in seconds what hours of modern analysis could not explain. Samuel glanced once more at the Apache, listening to the steady rhythm of the engine as if confirming the aircraft was satisfied again. Then he turned toward the general with the same calm expression he had carried since the moment he arrived. She just needed someone to hear her properly, he said. Whitaker gave a small, respectful nod. Across the flight line, the Apache now stood fully alive under the Texas sky, its engine steady and confident once again, while the technicians around it remained silent, understanding that the quiet old man beside them had just reminded everyone of a truth that machines never forget. Some lessons cannot be programmed. They have to be lived.